Good morning, everybody. My name is Ian Pratt. I'm the peacemonger. It's an early Sunday morning today because both me and my guests have extremely busy days today. I'm delighted to welcome Glenn Diesen, who I'm sure everybody watching this already knows. Glenn is a professor of political science in Norway. He also runs a wildly popular geopolitics podcast. And actually, I was lucky enough to meet Glenn in Tbilisi last year at a conference that we went to together. An amazing thing. And I think that's Glenn, the first time you actually met Alexander Makiris in person as well. But it was a terrific thing, and I'm just glad to consider Glenn, hopefully, a friend, and yeah, really excited to have this discussion today. Welcome to the show, Glenn.
Thank you, Ian. It's yeah, great to see you again.
So I often talk about this notion that Europe fights wars by committee, that they spend ages in working groups, talking around issues, never really decide on anything useful at the time. And that inevitably gives in terms of policy towards Ukraine, Russia a big advantage because Putin can decide everything. And a classic example of this week was the news that Europe is planning to nominate somebody to talk to Putin. The fact that they have to nominate one of the leaders of the countries is itself, ridiculous. And Alexander Stubb and Kaya Kallas, those well-known super diplomats, were in the frame. But this idea, was floated last year. I mean, it was definitely floated by Emmanuel Macron at the meeting where they decided not to steal Russia's kind of billions in Euroclear. I'm pretty sure Macron has raised it before then as well. And here we are in mid-January, and we're still kind of discussing in the committee. I mean, how do you explain this and bizarre approach where they can decide nothing and yet have opinions on everything?
No, it's a great question. Actually, in the past, the EU actually got a lot of its power from this kind of just regulating and writing these little memos because it was called a regulatory superpower. The general idea was, you have all these powerful economies together with collective bargaining power. Anyone who have to deal with them or trade with them would have to essentially comply with what the EU demanded. Again, this is back when the EU was relevant, and yeah, so this was seen as its main power, had a gravitational force. But now, of course, it's as you say, it's become complete nonsense. They sit and deliberate and plan, and at the end of the day, all they have is a letter they can come out up with, and no one's really paying attention to it, anyways. It was Romano Prodi. He once said that the EU was a giant with clay feet. Like it couldn't. It looks big, impressive, but it can't actually move. Once it tries to move, it falls apart. And no, I think this is the a key problem, and they want someone to take the EU seriously. But as you said, you have all this time they've been working on simply negotiating between themselves, not again who they should send, but even if they should talk to the Russians. Because we know the British, not part of the EU, but nonetheless they're opposed to it. We know the Lithuanians and all are also opposed to it. They would like to see Russia comply with all of the EU's demands before there will be any diplomacy. The problem is you can only do this if the opponent is willing to do it. At the moment, the Russians don't really seem interested in talking to the EU at all. Why not just talk directly to Washington, as opposed to what it's seen as being its vassals? So it's all the EU hasn't really adjusted to the new time, is what I'm getting at. And no, it's not great optics in terms of its relevance.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Glenn. And the thing is, Eric Cooper, the British Foreign Secretary, came out, I think, yesterday to say, well, even if Europe talks to Russia, we still won't talk to Russia until Vladimir Putin shows that he's sincere about peace. It's like another kind of standard line that seems to come out of King Charles Street
But I
every
think
time.
there's
But Russia's winning. I mean, I
yeah.
mean, what do they expect Russian to do to show they're willing for peace?
Well, this is a key problem, a deeper problem within diplomacy, a consequence of the unipolar order. Keep in mind that during the Cold War, diplomacy meant you sat down with the opponent, with the Soviet Union. You didn't have to agree with them, but that's again why you met, and you explain your mutual security concerns. You try to get some understanding for the other side, and you look for solutions which compromise in which the security of both sides will be elevated. After the Cold War, when all power was concentrated in the West, there wasn't any need for diplomacy to the same extent because why would you make compromise with others when you have all power? Furthermore, we defined our power in terms of values. We're just promoting democracy. So any compromise was seen as compromising on values. So why would we, a liberal democracy, compromise with an authoritarian state? Then we're betraying our own values. So diplomacy was redefined. We redefined it as a pedagogic relationship almost between a teacher and a student, and we would reward countries based on their good behavior. This is kind of the language we use. So if they have bad behavior, then we punish them. And part of the bad behavior, the punishment would be we don't talk to them. So diplomacy, instead of being a process, how you resolve differences, it became a reward. So if Russia or other countries did what they were told, were good boys in class, then they would be invited to the next meeting. So we would have, for example, NATO-Russia Council. We would set it up because the Russians behaved well. But as soon as we had a conflict over Georgia, we didn't use this to resolve the conflict. No, we said no. Now we will suspend discussions in this NATO-Russia Council because you have been behaved badly. So this is how diplomacy has been reconceptualized, and we see this now. The problem is that that world is over. The unipolar world is over, but the EU still really likes this role as the teacher. So even now, 4 years of war, and they still say, "Oh no, we can't talk to you until you do as you're told." It's very crazy if you're sitting in other parts of the world, but this has kind of been the main mentality among the Europeans for the past 30 years.
Yeah, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there, Glenn, and helped me think about it in a slightly different way as well. I mean, the unipolar world also brought with it unipolar values. And as you say, diplomacy was and dialogue was used as a reward for good behavior and taken away for bad behavior. And it seems to me that, I mean, Trump, like him or loathe him, I mean, he's a very controversial character right now, but he seems to recognize that a multipolar world is now here. And it only increasingly seems to be the Europeans and the British who are clinging on to the old order. I mean, how much longer do you think they can cling on to that, before they sink into complete irrelevance and economic and, as the Americans would say, civilizational decay?
Well, in political realism, you assume that a rational state would act in accordance, well, to maximize its own security interests. And in order to do this, it has to respond to the distribution of power. Now, to simplify, that simply means um, that you have to adjust to the world as it is. So the challenge for the Europeans is now, when we had the bipolar system in the Cold War or the unipolar, we had all these strategic incentives to tie the EU, the Europe, and the US together. The problem in the multipolar world is, first of all, the US can't be everywhere. So wants to focus on the Western hemisphere and Asia. That means it has to pivot away from Europe. This has been signaled ever since the time of Obama. So it's not all about Trump. So this is it. The US has few resources. It needs different priorities. So Europe is no longer it. And the Europeans in a multipolar world, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket because, especially only in the United States, because the US doesn't even want to be prioritizing Europe anymore. So what you want to do is what most of the world is doing: diversify your ties, trade a bit with the Americans, Russians, Chinese, Indians, the Turks, a bit with everyone. This way, you don't have excessive dependence on any one state or region, and you can then not just prosper more, but you can have more political autonomy. The EU did exactly the opposite. It really wants to cling on to the unipolar order with the dreams of a collective hegemon, standing on two legs, the US and the EU. But uh, but by doing so, they commit fully to a US that doesn't want to be there, and even you hear from the American administration, they kind of have a distaste for the Europeans because of their weakness. I mean, even J.D. Vance said, we need partners, not vassals. The US keeps insulting the Europeans and they keep bowing. Of course, the Americans can do anything they want. And if the Americans want to turn the screws on, well, what can the Europeans do? We cut ourselves off from the Russians, increasingly the Chinese. We even take hostile moves against the Indians. So we're doing everything exactly the opposite of what we should do. When should be diversifying, we're throwing everything into declining hegemon, which is looking to move away from Europe. It's quite foolish, but when you don't act according to the distribution of power and your interest, this is what happens. You see a collapse in relevance. And the EU itself is not going to last because once the EU doesn't deliver on the interest of its member states, the member states will then begin to pursue their own interests. So why would Latvia, Greece, Ireland, France all have the same foreign policy, same economic interest in a multipolar world? It doesn't make any sense at all. They would only do so if the EU functioned as a way of delivering clear, tangible economic benefits to its members, but it can't even do that anymore.
Yeah, no, it certainly can't. And one of the reasons that I kind of attribute that is that Europe has tried to become a geopolitical actor when it is fundamentally an economic and trading bloc with social and cultural kind of benefits that relate to peace that emerge from that. I mean, I think do you think Europe collectively has the intellectual power and the statesmanship to recognize that it needs to kind of back away from geopolitics and focus back in on what it was good at, which was the economic, social, and the cultural, and then the political benefits will kind of flow from that in terms of improved relations with its neighbors and the wider world.
I think first we need some regime changes across Europe because the current political leadership, I don't think they would understand it. But I agree with your assessment. The strength of the EU was geoeconomic. That is, they reduced the barriers trading with each other. They based this on a common history and civilization, and by doing so, they had a single market where they seek collective bargaining power and economic strength. This made sense. There was some derailment along the road. That is, as the world became more digital, even the Europeans themselves in the then the European community recognized back in the beginning of 90s that they had to digitalize, otherwise they would become a technological colony of the US and Japan, again, early 90s. But they never did. So now that we're going through this new industrial revolution where the digital economies, digital technologies begin to insert itself all over traditional industries, the Europeans don't really have much. So we don't have the same economic power anymore that unites the countries. So what will unite you then? Well, geopolitical, they say, but this doesn't really make sense. What is it that's going to unify all these countries, especially now in a multipolar world? There attempts to be this idea that if we just revert into a Cold War mentality that is, here's the Russians, we have to go into a generational fight against them, all this nonsense, then this will bring the Europeans together. The problem is, well, first, it is necessary to some extent if you're going to be a geopolitical power, because how would you otherwise unite 27 members? But the problem is this isn't a second Cold War. There is no Soviet Union, there is no global communism, there's no expansionist ambitions coming out of Moscow. And I know, yes, they have taken territories of the Ukrainians, but no one in Moscow were even talking about taking Crimea before the coup in 2014. So this is Russia responding to the revisionism coming from the West. That is an effort to expand this military bloc. So no, I think furthermore, the geopolitical goals of making, well, unifying around an offense against Russia, it undermines the foundation of a geoeconomic power because the economic power of Europe depended to a large extent on the cheap and reliable energy resources from Russia. It depended on this huge Russian market in which the Russians had prioritized Europeans to a large extent because they hoped for this common European home. All of this is gone now. The Europeans not just cut themselves off from, the Germans with the nuclear technology, nuclear energy, all of this. But now, of course, cutting themselves off from Russian energy and instead buying it 3, 4 times more expensive from the Americans. How how are you gonna you can't be a geoeconomic power anymore. They can try to revert into some geopolitical militaristic EU, but it's gonna fail because it doesn't reflect reality. You can only pretend that Putin is Hitler for so long before people begin to roll their eyes and the world moves on.
Yeah, I completely agree. And on the energy point, I mean that is kind of Europe's missing piece of its geoeconomic puzzle. It needs cheap energy, and the loss of cheap energy has led to massive deindustrialization across a bloc that hasn't yet fully recovered from the consequences of the global financial crisis. And whether that cheap energy is coming from, irrespective of which country that cheap energy comes from, it needs cheap energy. Russia has cheap energy. It can develop its own domestic industries. It can export. It imports, obviously, and the US is exactly the same. The US has abundant cheap energy. It's now trying to steal cheap energy from a neighboring country, but we'll get onto that a bit later. Europe does not have its own cheap energy, and Norway does, of course. The UK does to a certain extent, but not enough to meet domestic demand. And the obvious answer for Europe is to get back to having cheap energy, and that requires a rapprochement with Russia. It's just basic economics, and it's another reason I think why people should park the political ambitions and the desire to kind of somehow defeat Russia, which in any case seems impossible, and just focus back in on what made Europe great again. What do you think?
No, I agree. And also the idea that can break Russia economically is also foolish because there's another consequence of multipolarity. In the 1990s, if you would cut off trade with Russia, it has nowhere else to go. It would begin to crumble. Well, they try to do that anyways, but in the multipolar world, we see that the Russians are more capable of diversifying. They're diversifying their economy to the east. The Europeans don't have the same possibility. But I think the overarching problem here is with that after the Cold War, initially we were going to have a common Europe with the Russians. We had this deals such as the Charter of Paris for a new Europe, which wouldn't have any dividing lines in Europe. What we saw as necessary for the Europeans, because after all these years of having the American pacifier in Europe, something to unify, make us more relevant, an important economic and security partner, there was a priority to keep the Americans in Europe. And this is understandable. One can understand why. It's a very uncertain future if they're not. But it was also recognition that you wouldn't get the US into Europe if you actually accommodated Russia and brought it on the inside. And this was the main problem. A lot of the power structure of the political West was dependent on the Cold War. And Gorbachev actually made a comment about this at the end of the Cold War. He made a point that, if we would end the Cold War, both the power structure of the Soviet Union and the United States rested on this permanent confrontation, which, created these alliance systems. So what did we do? We started then develop a format for Europe based on collective hegemon, which means expanding NATO to eventually include everyone except Russia. And this unavoidably made an enemy out of Russia, as many people had predicted. But that was the price we paid. We wanted to keep America in Europe, and the price to pay was to make an enemy out of Russia. And we did this. But now, of course, we have to realize that the world has changed. The United States has other interests, and Russia is now in a position, it's not the 90s anymore, to hit back like George Kennan warned in the 90s. The time has come now. So now you have to adjust to reality, which means perhaps now we have to rethink this division of Europe. Because in divided Europe, the Europeans will be too dependent on the US, Russia would be excessively dependent on China. It would be better for us to find some way of resolving this, removing the dividing lines. Russia's not going to join the EU, but to have a common security, pan-European security architecture based on indivisible security. So one side doesn't enhance its security at the expense of others by, for example, moving NATO missiles into Ukraine. It's not acceptable. And also our energy, our geoeconomic status could improve because Russia has all the energy and also, it got very good technological sovereignty as well. If you look at its digital platforms, the Europeans do not have this. So there's a lot of opportunities here. But the first instinct once this war was triggered by us was, well, now we have to punish and destroy the Russians. They're Hitler, they want to restore the Soviet Union, all this nonsense. We should have, and this is our emotional responses, and they're dreaming about another bipolar Cold War or something. We should do the exact opposite. Recognize that this was a consequence of a changing world order and adjust to it, which means make peace with the Russians. This would have been good for us. It would be good for the Russians. It would definitely be good for the Ukrainians to remove them from this front line of a divided Europe. So, yeah, sorry for the very long-winded answer, but I think, yeah, this is at the heart of it. This redividing Europe, it has been a mistake. And even if it made some sense in the 90s, the distribution of power and the logic behind it, it is all gone now. So we need to adjust to that reality.
Yeah, that's really insightful, actually, particularly your observation about the collapse of the Soviet Union and prior to its collapse, the two different structures of power facing off against each other. I mean, I think that any bureaucracy, I basically see the European Union and NATO as a bureaucracy. I mean, they need a raison d'etre. And for NATO, obviously, that raison d'etre is very obviously countering Russia. But it seems to me that the EU's raison d'etre now is also only about countering Russia. So both the EU and NATO, as institutions, as bureaucracies, it seems to me, their reason to exist now appears to be countering Russia, together, which is a quite a bizarre situation to find ourselves in, and is another reason I think to I mean, you call it regime change. I call it institutional dismantlement, where you take both apart, or you significantly strip them of their powers and hand power back to the nation states, while keeping at the strategic level the trappings of unity together through open borders and economies and that sort of thing. I mean, what's your view?
No, I agree. And I think the universalist mentality within the EU as well is another consequence of the unipolar order. A lot of the problems within the EU, for example, can be resolved. This idea that you have to punish the Hungarians because they want to have control over the borders, that they want to prioritize more traditional conservative values, that they want to put an end to the war. Uh, even if you disagree with any of this, the idea that we can't find any common ground is quite yeah, is quite shocking. But sorry, I forgot the beginning of your question already.
Well, I was talking about the kind of the power structures and how essentially the EU and NATO have now assumed exactly the same, reason to exist, which is defeating Russia. So, whereas historically NATO was military and the EU was economic, now they both have the same purpose in life, which is to defeat Russia. And the answer is to actually strip them of their powers progressively and hand more power back to nation states.
Yeah, no, I think it's yeah, well, if you define the goal of the EU as well, defeating Russia or preventing it from reestablishing the Soviet Union, the EU doesn't have any purpose anymore, and then this is the problem. No, I think it has to go back to the core, its main idea. The benefit of the geoeconomic model for Europe as well was that it harmonized its interests. It created common goals in terms of all countries pooling their economic power in order for, well, essentially two and two to be more than four. And well, they're not doing this anymore. And as you said, part of the problem is also accepting that you don't need a model for always centralizing power in the EU. And you've seen that with this war as well. As soon as the Russians invaded, it was seen as a massive opportunity because don't let the crisis go to waste. Now you can begin to centralize powers in Brussels. And I think you and I have spoken before about these two different models you could have for European integration. Actually, one of my favorite scholars on this is a British scholar, David Mitrany, who wrote in the 1960s about this, that you have two formats for European integration, functionalist or federalist. The functionalist would just look at the areas where it makes sense. If we begin to integrate, well, why? Is it an area that creates better governance, more economic strength, or better security? Okay, then we do it. It makes sense. It has a clear function. So the function of integration, that's the focus, and that will dictate the form. And then you had the other side, which was led by the Germans and other, which was a federalist approach. And they just decided we're going to be the United States of Europe. So given that this is our goal, we already have the form clear. We have to centralize power. Now we just the functions will depend on well, however we can integrate it, how we can centralize power. So his concern, therefore, was that the EU or the European integration project would simply become very authoritarian. It would be more like the Soviet Union than the United States. It would be economically less competitive. Security-wise, it would undermine itself. And that's what we have today. Look at what we're doing. Uh, in key areas where it would be better not to centralize economic decision making, we do it nonetheless and become less economic dependent. We look, okay, we have to integrate, have a common security or foreign policy. Okay, well, then we need a clear external enemy so we can unite 27 member states. So we make up these stories about, the Russians being pure evil. It's not possible to negotiate with them. All this nonsense. And so we should do the opposite. We should go back to the drawing boards and give up this idea of constantly centralizing power in Brussels. If it makes sense economically, security, and politically, then one can centralize power. But it can't be the ultimate goal, which then dictates all the functions. So I think, well, from my perspective, this is the main problem. And also defeating Russia, I always ask ever since we decided, well, came up with this objective, what do we think how do we think this is going to end? What is the goal? How do you defeat the world's largest nuclear power, which believes that this is a fight for its very existence? How do you sanction a country like Russia into weakness when it's prioritizing now its Eastern partners, where it gets everything it needs for trade and it doesn't depend on the Europeans anymore? Like none of this makes sense. And also in this struggle, with really trying to cosplay World War II, the problem is it's a bit like the British and the Russians in the
Great
19th
game.
century. While they go head at head, you have new centers of power emerging. You have the British, you have the Americans. No, sorry, British. You have the Americans, the Germans, the Japanese, all growing up at the periphery. And this is the thing: the world is not Europe or EU and Russia centric anymore. We're not even. There's two major powers, which is the US and China, and so we were fighting yesterday's wars. It's yeah, very destructive.
Yeah. And I think we'll look back in history and realize that perhaps the Lisbon Treaty was a big mistake, actually, in terms of really developing the common foreign security policy and creating this increasingly dangerous, uh, foreign minister type role, in the European Union. I think it's a terrible mistake. You sparked a thought in me, and I've never actually written about this. Perhaps I should in my next article. But I've often said that with the Russians, you should a good rule of thumb is to do the opposite to what you think might make sense. For
Well,
policymakers. Well, when you want to attack them, shake their hand, and you'll be surprised actually that they'd shake your hand back. If you want to sanction them, actually maybe think about whether you're going to harm yourself more, by doing that. And I think there's something there about European policymakers maybe doing a complete 180 and trying to engage with Russia in a different way because if you ask a Russian for a fight, they'll fight you. But if you ask a Russian for, to shake their hand, or have a vodka taste, that they will happily do that with a big smile. And I think we just part of it is our lack of curiosity and really understanding the Russians and wanting to engage with them because we've got diplomacy. I don't know what your reflections are on that.
no, I agree. For the past 20 years, whenever someone has advised, well, maybe we can try to improve relations here or there, then the answer would be, well, that's what Putin wants, as if that's a bad thing. All of the assumption being that we should do exact opposite of what Putin wants. Sometimes it's good to take into consideration your opponent's security concerns. The idea that if we always work against the Russians, then somehow this will be good for us, I think it's a failure. But also what you said about the reaching out the hand instead of trying to sanction or go to war. Look at how they're reacting now to the United States. The U.S. has been the leading actor in this war against Russia since the coup in 2014. Keep in mind that the day after the coup, it was the US that began to take control of the Ukrainian security intelligence agencies. It was the one who's training and financing the right-wing fascist groups. It was the one who was hijacking the government in Ukraine, as there's plenty of evidence of. It was the one sending the weapons. It was the one hijacking civil society, the media. It's been the one most responsible for killing tens of thousands of Russians, and it's still doing it, sending this stuff, weapons, and being the leading actor in this proxy war. Nonetheless, as soon as the United States said, "Hey, maybe we can start to have some proper restoring relations and get along," uh, the resentment towards the United States has declined dramatically. Now they see the main problem being the Germans and the British. So, you know, you can fix the things with the Russians. It's just the problem is in Europe we don't have the same room of maneuver as the Americans have, because when you have 27 member states, how do you agree on a common policy? How do you agree on 27 countries continuously fighting Russia, sending weapons, not doing diplomacy? You have to always communicate everything in this really radical language of good versus evil. And this is what we've done. Putin is Hitler. They just want to swallow up all of Europe. We speak in this language. We can't even sit down and talk to them because the Russians are just so completely evil. Then this is a once you get like all the member states to sign up to this. Yes, it was an unprovoked in war because they want to expand the Soviet Union or restore it. And it's Hitler. Once you get all the member states to agree with this narrative, now there can't be any dissent. Who would want to reach out a hand to Hitler? Nobody. So, but it always depends. Unity depends on this really radical narratives, which makes it impossible to have dissent within the EU, because it is impossible within the EU now to speak normally about Russia. And this is how you create consensus. The problem is there's no room for maneuver. Now that we're even losing the war, at best we can lose it a bit slower and then wasting more lives and territory. But nonetheless, this is how we here locked ourselves in. But this is another problem of trying to have this common foreign policy, which is this is the price we have to pay. You can't have rational debate with pluralism of ideas if you expect 27 countries to agree. You need this fanatical good versus evil rhetoric. The problem is it is very harmful to us, our own interest. But for even suggesting this, in the EU language, I might be a Putinist and apologist because so this is the reason why we speak like this in Europe, and I think it's much of it's about trying to force 27 countries to have the same policy.
Yeah, it completely is. And to go back to the point I sort of made, right at the start, if it takes us several months just to decide on whether somebody should talk to, Russia and who that person should be, and that conversation is still unresolved. I mean, how do we deal with bigger questions like how do we end the war? How do we reboost, European economic greatness? How do we secure, provide for peace and security on this massive Eurasian, continent? I mean, these are the big questions. Not talking for months about who should talk to Putin. I mean, that goes right to the heart of it. It seems to me that we could decide to wipe our backsides, frankly, in Brussels. They'd take weeks about, well, what sort of toilet, what does a toilet seat look like? Probably. Anyway, that's getting a bit distracted, but you get the idea. I mean, we're not talking about, and of course, now with what's happening in Greenland, I worry that people are going to forget about Ukraine, and it's going to, people are focusing west now, and the Ukraine war is going to bubble on because nobody has any ideas.
Well, this is the problem. There is for 4 years we had all this peace summits all over the place, and but we never actually invited the Russians there, and we didn't talk about peace because this wasn't possible. We just called it a peace summit to make it sound like we're yeah this well, it sounds better than a war summit. But as you said, now the main discussion within the EU is Can we talk to the Russians? We can't agree on this. And if we can't talk to them, who should represent the Europeans? We can't agree on this either. And this begs the question then, what happens if we would actually, by some miracle, be able to agree on these things? How would that work out when we sit down with the Russians? Because the Europeans kind of committed to this common position that Ukraine has to be a part of NATO. Russia should have no veto over European security at all, even though it's the largest European power. The Russians should pay reparations. If we should have European troops in Ukraine, we already dug in our heels very deep on these issues. So how are we going to have consensus on anything that the Russians demand? Because all of these things are red lines for the Russians. So there's nowhere to go from here. It's completely pointless. But again, how do you reform to the new realities of the world? I don't think the EU is fit for purpose. And the Greenland response, again, I yeah, we made ourselves so dependent on the United States, and we have to assess the American position as they go into multipolar world. They know that the Chinese are going to start to compete with them other places. They know that alliances will begin to fragment. So what will they want to do? They can't depend that much on the alliance system. They will begin to now ask for the Taiwanese to transfer semiconductor factories to the US. They would want to seize territories like Greenland. They're preparing themselves for the multipolar world, which they can't rely on the structures of the past. So we made ourselves so increasingly dependent on a country which can't really provide the same as it did in the past in terms of generous trade agreements or security arrangements. They will form Europe, the relationship with Europeans into an extractive relationship, exploitative. This is so the worst point in time to put all our eggs in the American basket. So if the Americans want Greenland, there's nothing you can do. The best thing I think you can do is maybe what they're doing now, send a few troops, and if the Americans want to take it, they function as a kind of a tripwire. If they have to kill a lot of well, there's not a lot of soldiers, but if they have to kill a lot of European soldiers, then that would kind of be a deterrent that, well, then all the partnership would fall apart. This would be very unpopular within the US as well. But that's essentially the best strategy we have. Just let a lot of Europeans die if they decide to take Greenland, because Trump is the president of low-hanging fruit. He would like just to go in, take Greenland and say, listen, we can keep NATO, we can be best friends, but then you can't object to this anymore. And that's essentially his strategies. He's done that everywhere. Every time he starts a conflict, be it Iran or anyone else, he goes in heavy and then he says, okay, listen, it's all done and done now. We can normalize things. He did the same with Venezuela as well. So he's going to do the same with the Europeans. So essentially, the Europeans should do the exact opposite. Make sure that it would be a tremendous mess if he would go for this. But we can't fight the Americans. So all we can do is send our troops there to make sure a lot of Europeans die if he tries to take Greenland. It's a stupid and horrible strategy, but I'm not sure what else the Europeans can do at this point after its decades of foolish policies.
Yeah, well, in that European military response, I was actually, because I have a lot of respect for the country Norway, immense respect for Norway, and their military, your military kind of response to Greenland was twice the size of the British military response, which I was really impressed by because you sent two troops
Yeah.
and we sent one. But
I
this,
see. Yeah, when I
go on.
said we should do what we're doing now, I did no, not on this scale. It's just then it would be better to do nothing almost. This makes no sense to me. Why would you send one guy? Or at least we sent twice as much as the British. But after fighting and now crossing a proxy war and direct war with Russia, the world's largest nuclear power, and we can't even send a few troops to Greenland, not to attack America, but just to be there and to show solidarity. We can't, if anything, they will pull them out as well, probably, because, as you know, Trump now pulls
Threatening
out the tariff
tariffs.
weapon. And why
Yeah.
wouldn't he? Every time he threatens, the European bows to pressure. So now he says 10% tariffs on all the Europeans who have sent soldiers or resisting the annexation of Greenland.
Yeah.
And if you don't bow to this pressure, we're gonna crank it up to 25%. So yeah.
Yeah, and I actually think that the best response to this sort of bullying behavior is like the Chinese did last year after the big tariff hike, which was just to face him down and say, okay, we'll increase our tariffs. And I think, but at the moment, the US-Europe relationship is a bit like a marriage breaking apart with an abusive husband and their partner sort of clinging on to them for dear life while the abusive husband continues to beat them.
Well, that's a good
Unfortunately.
Well, it's a good description, but it also shows. But that is why the Europeans should address the main issue. That is the dependence, like the beaten wife. We need to have something somewhere to go. But when you study civil wars, this is a similar problem. If you have civil war between two factions, then they would begin to look towards external sponsors who will, help them. After a while, you will see the external party being able to dictate the policy and the direction of the war. So they will take over ownership because they create dependence. And this is the same with alliance systems. Um, that is, when there's conflicts, such as during the Cold War, you grow this excessive dependence, and then the dominant state can take a lot of benefits. But at least during the Cold War, the US saw a threat from the Soviet Union, so they had an interest in not taking too much advantage of this dependence. But now, no one they don't seriously think the US that in the US that Russia is the main threat to the United States. This is again,
But
this is
because it
the world
isn't.
the Europeans are living in. No, but this is what we have to do. We have massive security dependence on the Americans, massive economic, but the security is also important. Why are the Europeans trying to prolong the war? They're the main actor now pushing to prolong the war. But by prolonging the war, we develop this really intense security dependence on the Americans, which allows the Americans to do whatever they want. Because why wouldn't they? They don't see this war we're pushing with the Russians as being serious anymore. This is no one's really believing that the Russians will march on Berlin once they're done with Ukraine. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. But
It doesn't. And
no.
the only answer, frankly, is and I probably should wrap up now, but it is a reset with Russia that obviously includes Ukraine, although that's going to take generations, frankly, to kind of reset Russia-Ukraine relations in any kind of meaningful way, and for a radical kind of scaling down of the powers of the European Union institutions, and probably a complete dismantling of NATO. I mean, I think it's probably how I'd summarize it. And I think that process is started on NATO more than on the EU. That NATO process has already started. I think the EU process is going to start in 2027 when the French and the Polish elections, happen, and in 2029 when the British and the German elections happen. I mean, that's just how I forecast it. But in closing, any final kind of reflections on that?
Well, just that. Well, when the Cold War came to an end, we saw in the beginning of the 1990s, the Europeans began to speak in the language of European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. These are words for having more independence from the United States to have more self-governance. The reason why this happened then was because the enemy was gone. And then that security dependence reduces, and now you can have some autonomy. You can even diversify, have more partners. When we decided to go for the keep the Americans locked here and redivided the continent, made an enemy out of Russia, we essentially went back to the Cold War. Now we're stuck in the same dependence, and all our strategies ever since has been. We looked at Ukraine all the way up to 2014. Every poll showed that they preferred Russia as a partner. The minority of people actually wanted to be part of NATO. We saw these things and we saw it as a problem because we only had the form in our mind, which is you have to have a NATO and EU centric, which means the closeness between Ukraine and Russia was a problem. So if you split Russia and Ukraine, that's a win in this mentality. But of course, you have to assess what did we think was going to happen? Were the Russians going to simply capitulate and say, "Oh, well, I guess NATO will move into Ukraine"? No. Once we destroyed that relationship, the Russians went in militarily, and now we have a massive mess on our hands. So, again, my final thought is just adjust to realities. Uh, yeah, I know the 90s were a great time for the Europeans, but it's gonna be you can't go back to the 90s, and trying to pretend, live in a world as you wish it was instead of how it is. This is going to be the source of Europe's destruction. So, yeah, no, it's not good good times in Europe at the moment, and I must say some of this feels like an alternate reality where the Americans are tariffing Europe until they
So,
accept the annexation of Greenland.
it's
But here
very,
we
very
are.
bizarre. Very, very bizarre alternative reality. Glenn Diesen, thank you so much. It's always terrific to talk to you, and I'm glad actually to welcome you onto my YouTube. I hope to reappear on yours as well at any time that you want. I hope viewers have enjoyed this discussion today. If you did, please continue to like and subscribe to help me as I grow my channel. I'm only 2 weeks in, but I've already got 2,000 subscribers. So thank you so much for everybody who's provided support so far. And until my next video, I wish you all very much peace.